All right. Welcome everyone to Unsafe Space Book Club. I think everything's working now. I think we've got a whole bunch of people in chat here. You're watching Unsafe Space. I'm your host Carter Laren, and I'm joined, as always, by Carrie. Carrie, say something.
Hi, Carter. Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.
Oh, we
So,
sh- we should say it's happy birthday to Chris in the UK. I don't know if he's able to join us today, but it's his birthday.
okay, cool. Well, Carrie, I think was this your book pick? I feel like it was your book pick.
I'm sorry.
No, it was fine. It was a
Yeah.
good book. It was a
Okay.
good pick. Uh,
Yeah, it was a tough read.
but we're going to talk about Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and the Final Solution in Poland. So right away from the title, you know it's not going to be a fun read. By Christopher Browning. And we've got, I don't know, probably a dozen panelists today, a dozen people in book club. So welcome everyone to book club. Carrie, do you want to start with your general impressions? I mean, there's a lot to talk about with this book. So
Well, yeah, I this was actually something that was on Jordan Peterson's recommended book list. So that was part of the reason why I wanted to read it, because uh especially because where we find ourselves out in society, what's unfolding around us right now, you see a lot of people who are claiming that they are behaving uh, in a morally just way, when what I believe they're doing is conforming and following some kind of ideological authority. And they claim to be on the right side of history. And I think, I'm really fascinated in how why it is that, the title of this book, Ordinary Men, how do you get ordinary people to participate in atrocious things on a magnificent scale? And so I thought this book might have some, special relevance right now. And I think one way in which people you're able to motivate people to behave in evil ways is because of a lack of introspection that we have about our own capacity for evil. And so people who a lot of the people on the, I would say, like the SJW left or the authoritarian left at this moment in history, I think they believe they are acting, they believe, a lot of them are acting in good faith. They think that they're on the, that they're doing something moral and just. And because of that lack of introspection, I think it sets them up to maybe start participating in the exact opposite without realizing they're doing it. So that was my reason for picking this book. Overall impressions, it was a lot of dates, and there was so much. It was so thorough and so factual with so many dates and numbers, and that it was hard for me to retain a lot of information until he got to the part about, um, conformity and authority and the studies uh, about the psychological process of being indoctrinated ideologically. So that was my favorite part, which was towards the end.
yeah,
What about
it
you?
was like I did find it a little bit too military history at the beginning of like this battalion did this and that battalion did that, and that was a little bit difficult. But I didn't find the thing that I mean I'd love to hear from other people, but I didn't find the psychological analysis portions to be new or the description of the atrocities. Like they were in line, like they were what I expected. But but what resonated with me, what I really liked, especially reading this now, is that when he got to the analysis sections, um, and both in the afterward and my version had a 25 years later thing section, um, I felt like what he was saying is very much in line with what we have been saying about the modern left, and the parallels were quite striking to me. And I mean, we can talk about some of them later, but I highlighted a bunch of sections that were just, you could have been writing them about the modern left today, but he's writing them about Nazis in the early 1940s, and that was pretty scary. And right down to like the criticisms, the guy Goldhagen that was criticizing him, basically he was doing the univariate fallacy thing. Nope, there's only one reason, and this is what it is. Stop making it complex. The Germans are bad, bad, bad. Like that's basically his reason, right? Which is, to me, smacks entirely of what the left says. It's like it's that univariate solution to everything and no nuance. And that's what I really liked about this book, is the analysis really resonated with me and seemed to really parallel everything that we're saying about the left.
Yeah. Who else is here? Anybody else have some? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here, Christina.
Hi, Christina.
Before I read this, I think it was Roy Baumeister. He wrote Violence Inside Human Evil, Inside Human Violence and Cruelty. And I think that really, really breaks things down. And he breaks down evil into like instrumental evil, ideological evil, and that there are different kinds of evil at play. Like some of these people were doing it because they wanted security in their jobs. Some people were just convinced that they're going up against bad people. And I think what we're facing right now is the ideological evil, where people have convinced themselves that their cause is so just and they are fighting people who are so bad that then anything you do becomes justified. And I think you've heard where terrorists say, they'll go, how can you blow up a building full of innocent children? And they'll go, there are no innocents. And that's where it's really easy to get sucked in, to where you start viewing your opponents as being so evil and your cause is so just that anything you do is justified. And we see that in Antifa, where they've got that by any means necessary. They really have sold.
Something I noticed is liberals tend to assume people are inherently good. This denies personal responsibility, and it makes crime, poverty, mental illness, and suffering always the fault of an imperfect society. Therefore, the logical solution is we have to remake society out of utopian impulse. And Antifa is sitting there going, we need to impose socialism, environmental rationing, etc. It's like, you haven't looked at history of how racist socialism and communism is, from the Soviet Union persecuting and relocating ethnic minorities to China, rounding up the Muslim Uyghurs. And they're trying, and when you sit there and try to do utopianism and you don't end murder, and you don't end corruption, and you don't end dissidents, okay, we're going to have our scapegoat group that we blame. For a lot of European history, it was the Jews. The Soviets also blamed the kulaks, who were the middle-class farmers that were a little bit better than the peasants. You've often seen blame of the religious, which is also happening in our society. You get blaming of various political groups, hence the demonization of conservatives right now. And it's like, we want utopia. We want a perfect society. You're in the way. We're good. We want it better. You're evil. If you don't go along, we have to suppress you, oppress you, or kill you to get paradise on earth. And that's the logical flow you see, and I'm quoting a lot from Peterson, but from other sources as well, from Pol Pot's Cambodia to Antifa and by any means necessary today. The only solution for them is more liberal power, more liberal government, all in the name of creating perfection. And history doesn't matter. That's not real communism. History doesn't matter. We're different.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me was in the analysis, the author specifically talking about how the Nazi culture rejected the Enlightenment and rejected Enlightenment values, which is, again, what we're seeing from the radical left today. I mean, just remember we talked the other day about how individual rights is now considered dog whistling for quote, white supremacy. Well, let me just read this passage on my version. It's page 217. It's in the afterword. And it says, it was precisely the Nazis' demolition of democracy and the restoration of an authoritarian political system, emphasizing communal obligations over individual rights, that gave them legitimacy and popularity among significant segments of the German population. It's exactly that. It's it's basically what he's saying is it's collectivism over individualism that enabled all of this behavior. And I just finished reading Stanley Milgram's book about the prison experiment, or sorry, the Milgram experiment, and it's fascinating to me that both you could see in this book both the appeal to authority happening and the conformity pressures that the soldiers had. Like one thing Milgram pointed out was the more you could separate a task into different things. So like one person gave this order and the next person did this step and the next person did that step and the next person did that step, the less ownership anyone in that chain felt for the moral consequences of what they were doing, or the moral weight of what they were doing. So it's like, well, I was just told to move the Jews to this spot. Well, I just moved the Jews from this spot to this spot. Well, all I did was well, I just shoot the guy that was in front of me. I didn't put him there. So they all were able to blame authority. And something that Milgram talks about, which I think this book touched on a little bit, was when people get into that mindset of abdicating moral responsibility to authority, the way that they start to measure their own goodness is how well they perform the task requested of them, because they've removed the moral they've removed the idea that they have to choose the task morally, and so the task could be immoral. That's now someone else's responsibility. To be a good person, they now have to do the task as well as they can. And that's why you get people really fastidious about train schedules to Auschwitz and all that kind of stuff. They're doing the task. They're trying to perform well. Their new version of being moral is how well they listen to authoritarians and how well they perform their task.
Hey Carter,
That
what
makes me-
page was that on? That the collectivism versus individualism thing?
There was a bunch of quotes. The one I just read was in my book, it was page 217 in the afterword.
Okay.
But there's a bunch. I mean, there's stuff in the 25 years later section. But the one I just read was on page 217.
You're also making me think of how they when they were given the option, I think it was towards the beginning where they were asked before one of the first mass killings, if anyone doesn't think they're up for it, you can leave now. And 12 people left out of like 500. But then in subsequent killings, when they weren't given that option, it was like, I think he used the word relief. It was a sense of relief, as if they didn't have to make the choice. This is what, there's no choice given. It's not my fault because this is what we're.
Yeah, that was one of the things that Milgram noticed, was that like when the people were performing the tasks, almost all of them found the tasks very distasteful. They were disgusted by the fact that they, quote, had to do this. And so they didn't want to be in a situation where they're being told to do something, and like that choice, I would imagine, actually gives them more angst, because now they have to be involved in the decision. They want it removed from them. And even though a lot of these people obviously killed the Jews and behaved in this abhorrent way, they also held this vision of themselves as like, well, I was against it. I thought it was disgusting, or I didn't like it. And that's kind of their rationalization for they're protecting their own sense of goodness, right?
Can I give my overall impression here, Carter? So it reminded me of what both you and Carrie said, something about the beginning of the book with all the numbers and all the steps. And I got kind of bored with it, where I was like, okay, and I hate saying this out loud, or I get bored of reading about 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people murdered. But overall, it started to make me think about them having to make sure that they pointed out the very specific manner in which they wanted to show the world what actually happened, and that there were records, and that this is not just an assumption that it happened, because I know that there's large groups of people out there who still don't believe that it was as bad as they want you to think it was. So I think that is one aspect of them going through all of the names. And they kind of did that in, I think it was the Iliad, where Homer specifically went through and named all of these characters that weren't main characters, but as a way to remind you of the depth at which all of those people were individuals and mattered. And then also that the fact that they kept these records struck me as unusual, in the sense that if I was going to murder somebody, the last thing I'm going to do is write a blog about it. So if they're writing about it and keeping these records, that tells me that there's something in their minds that separates them from it or makes them think that that is a normal thing to do. So the fact that they have these extensive records should tell us that there was something that told them that this was okay. So they went so far mentally into whatever their task was, which was just mass murder, that they felt okay keeping records and weren't worried about people. Oh, here, look at you did this. That's what really struck me about that part.
I think the records are part of it. Like that's adds legitimacy to them. So the fact that they kept detailed records, they say this is a military campaign. The orders are from above. Like the records help everybody say this is what we should do, and that takes people out of the personal responsibility. Like, okay, this person ordered this. We killed 2,742 people today. You know, they like write it all down and save it. And I also think another factor of that is that it is Germans. I don't know how many you know Germans. I've spent a lot of time in Germany for work. Like they don't need speed limits on the road. Like Germans, you just tell them drive safe and that works fine. You know, they don't have turnstiles on the subways in Hamburg. That's where these people are from. They're Hamburg police. Like you're just supposed to pay, and Germans don't need a turnstile. They don't even need to show anybody a ticket. Everybody just pays because that's the rule. So some of it could be German. I think it would be harder in the US for this to happen, but not impossible.
There was a certain notes where I saw the morality of things, like the men were uncomfortable killing women and children and protested it, or they were told to kill the little kids. And at the gathering point, there were still a lot of women carrying the children because the guys couldn't do it until the people were lined up at the edge of the pits and then shooting from across the pit. So it wasn't I'm bayoneting a woman and baby, it's I'm shooting this figure in the distance, I don't care, or less so.
Yeah, and to your point, Keith, I remember reading something about, on my book, it was on page 136. So this is the copy that I have. But some of the Jews thought that the utilitarian manner in which the Germans behaved would be a saving grace for those individual Jews if they were useful to the Germans, because they thought they're so utilitarian. If I show that I can be productive with the war effort, if I'm working in the machine shop or doing this and that and the other, that their salvation would be their labor. So I think that fits into your description of their on the ground perception of German personalities.
And a lot of the Jews were German, so they're familiar with it. They had the same policy. I wonder if that's a factor in why so many of the Jews just went along. They told them to walk over here, lay down in this ditch. They just did it all. Like they're Germans too.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I think
it's necessarily.
Go ahead. Was that Christina? Go ahead. Oh.
Oh, I think Christina's video is frozen.
Okay. Yeah, I think Christina's. I can't hear Christina. I don't know if other people can. No.
Hey, Christina, I think your Wi-Fi connection or whatever is low because you're frozen.
You know, we're gonna let you be frozen, Christina. Sorry.
The reign of
It's weird because she appears muted, but to me, but we're still hearing
Christina.
robot voice.
I was reading.
And she's gone. Okay. I'm gonna say something about what Keith was just talking about. The guy criticizing Browning what was his name? Goldhagen. He was talking about he talked about the difference between German culture, fundamentally, and obviously his argument that this was a uniquely German thing, and maybe that was a contributing factor, because Keith, you're talking about this like kind of obeying authority kind of thing. But one thing that I hadn't realized about Germany too much, and it makes sense knowing the history, I guess this makes sense. I was surprised to learn that they didn't really embrace the Enlightenment fully, which again makes sense. So let me just read this passage from the 25 years later section in my book. It's page 240. It says, the emotional power and need for belonging embodied these two myths. He's talking about a myth of like the people's community, and a myth called Kameradschaft, which is like a soldiers' camaraderie between soldiers. Enabled the Nazis to preside over a moral revolution in which the Western tradition of universalism, humanity, and individual responsibility based on a guilt culture was replaced by a shame culture that elevated loyalty to and standing within the group to be the new moral fulcrum of German society. And there's a couple spots in this book where he talks about the Germans explicitly rejecting parts of the Enlightenment. And I think that probably made German society particularly vulnerable to this, right? Because they still had a collectivist mentality. Conformity was a strong force.
Well, I mean, and that goes to your point earlier about the parallels with the modern left. I mean, rejecting Enlightenment values. Where have we seen that lately?
Right. There's another I'm sorry, I'm just reading passages, but I love these because they parallel so well. On page 195, again in the afterword in my book, he says, according to the cultural ideological approach, the distorted and incomplete embrace of the Enlightenment by some German intellectuals, followed by their despair over an increasingly endangered and dissolving traditional world, led to a continuing rejection of liberal democratic values and traditions on the one hand, and a selective reconciliation with aspects of modernity on the other, producing what Jeffrey Herf termed a particularly German reactionary modernism. So again, it's the German intellectuals, which shouldn't surprise us because we know the Frankfurt School was full of these people, all collectivists, who were kind of rejecting this Enlightenment thing, and they didn't like how the Enlightenment was going, and they never really got there. They were not happy with the French Revolution or anything like that. I mean, it makes it easy for someone to come to power and leverage collectivism and brotherhood and national pride, and even racial purity in order to, convince people of this kind of stuff.
And I wonder if you aren't embracing Enlightenment values, and you're not embracing some religious, spiritual values, what are your values exactly? Like even right now, as people are on the left rejecting Enlightenment values, they are also talking about the churches, and they often reject religious values. What's left? Like, well, I don't know what and maybe that's a part of the problem. I don't know how somebody like that would answer that question. But what are the roots of whatever it is you say you believe that produces whatever action you're taking?
I think one of the problems with that question is you have to first decide if they have any values. Like you're making an assumption that they have values, and I don't see that at all.
I think
I don't know. They do
replace
them with.
They do.
Go ahead, Carrie.
I think what Thomas is saying is, well, it makes me think of this part I wanted to talk about actually, but this part about the Milgram experience. He was saying that action followed ideological belief. Once you had people aligned with an ideological belief, then the action would follow easily. And Carter, you were talking earlier about parallels with the modern left, and one of the big ones I saw was it was talking about the way that they trained these officers, and it said in addition to on my copy of the book, I think I have the same one as Thomas. This is page 177, but it said, in addition to being trained in physical fitness, use of weapons and police techniques, all battalions were to be strengthened in character and ideology. Basic training included a 1-month unit on ideological education. One topic for the first week was, quote, race as the basis of our worldview, end quote. Okay, parallels with the modern left. They're all reading white fragility like it's the Bible right now. You know, that, what is the basis of that belief system? Race. It's the same thing. Race, sex, identity is at the core of the belief system, that you're supposed to look at the world, well, the same way as they said here. Race is the basis of our worldview. But then it goes on and says officers were required to attend 1-week workshops that included 1 hour of ideological instruction for themselves and 1 hour of practice in the ideological instruction of others. What does that remind you of? I'm in a ton of SJW groups. This is what they're doing. Yeah, there's evangelicals. They're leftist evangelicals, the ones that I'm seeing around me right now. Yeah, exactly. They're like all these companies now. I know, I've heard from people. I know Dr. K on her show was talking about having heard from people who their workplaces are requiring them to receive ideological instruction now.
Oh, we've seen police departments sending out things asking for ideological instruction. Yeah. By the way, Carrie, now. I had that exact quote highlighted as well. It's so poignant. Yeah, it's like, me too. I feel like, oh, that's exactly the left right now. Race as the basis of our worldview.
Yeah, okay. And everybody needs to be instructed. I don't know if you guys saw this, but I went to the Unsafe Space book club page on Facebook yesterday just to see if anybody had questions about joining the chat. And at the top was a sponsored ad. I took a screenshot of it from Facebook, and it was like, join us for, it basically was an ideological instruction seminar. Join us at Facebook community, where we're going to hear from Black community leaders on ideological instruction. That's not the word they used, but that's exactly what it was. I'm like, thank you. Facebook is now indoctrinating people, and we can all, from our pages, we see the advertisement, can click on it and just sit in on an indoctrination class. I don't know.
My wife is a psychologist, and she's in private practice, and there's social media groups that she's a part of. And I think that's starting to happen there.
I'm wondering also, just to take this back just a little bit, when you were talking about the Germans taking the Enlightenment, or kind of rejecting the Enlightenment values, I think maybe they took the parts that they wanted for scientific advancement and, technologies and things like that to serve their state ideals or whatever. And I wonder what part the mythology played in that, creating this fake mythology of greatness and purity and all of these things. And I wonder what are the parallels to what we're living right now? What's the fake mythology that is being pumped out to, to get everybody drunk on how right they are, to fight and mob and call everybody evil?
I think it's very much what we would call the Messianic tradition, where there's, in Christianity and Judaism, there's a Messiah coming, so we're moving towards a better situation for the world. I think it's like in the book of Jeremiah and the letters from Paul. That's very much where we get this idea that we're moving towards progress. And then you see it so long story short, the idea is at the very end that you don't need necessarily the laws of the land or the laws of man or even the Bible itself, because the laws of God and righteousness are written on the heart of every man and woman.
It's almost like they're taking the positive things and just turning them completely upside down and corrupting, and I don't know, like infecting them with some kind of disease where it starts out as a good idea or a good thing, and then they just use it for their nefarious
Yeah, well, even with that
purposes.
tradition, you can see exactly where they take it, because the Marxist tradition says exactly the same thing in some sense, to where socialism goes to communism, then the state, which is the law, dissolves because all people are on board with the program. So the law is written on your heart. You don't need it anymore because everybody is a good person. So there's a lot of that
Right.
tradition that's already woven into like their ideology. So they're taking what Marx says and saying, yeah, that's good stuff, which has already been going on for thousands of years. The difference is they get to make the decision and man is at the top, as opposed to having something above individual people that guides us in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Well,
You know, it's interesting about this. Sorry, I just want to this is a pattern that I think is just I don't think it's unique to the left or the right. This is power hungry people. These are people who want power. And I see this over and over again in I think basically every major leftist and rightist government, if you want to call it rightist government, which is they see the progress of the Enlightenment, right? They see the industrial or technical progress of the Enlightenment, and they want its products, right? Marx wanted the
Yes.
products. And so what did he say? Seize the means of production, right?
Mhm.
That seize the means of production could be applied to any group. It could be applied to Nazis who want to seize the means of production. I mean, seize the things, get the Jews out. They need to own it. You can apply that to a group. You can apply it to a dictator. You can apply that to the proletariat. But none of them recognize that the means of production is a free society where individuals are free to use their brains and have individual rights. Like that's the actual means of production. The means of production aren't factories that come down like manna from heaven and land magically in your city. The means of production is capitalism. Basically, it is individual freedom. That's the means of production. And all of these people, I think all of these ideologies, they just look at those products and they think to themselves, how can they forget where they came from. So they're ignorant of how those products came to being. And now that they're here, it's like a savage, right? Who doesn't understand how the cell phone works, but now that it's here, he's going to use it to hit a rock or whatever. Like he needs it for something. So they want to grab the stuff that they don't understand the origins of for themselves and use it to propel themselves into power. And some of them do it through appealing to the proletariat. Some of them appeal to German nationalism. But it doesn't matter. It's all the same kind of, it's a very primitive mentality.
They're essentially
really dumb.
the same. I grew up in Lithuania, which was part of the Soviet Union for, 50 years or so. And I was about 13 when all of that changed, and it really is the same. And I remember, just in history classes, it was always, the Nazis were horrible, they were bad, they were evil, but somehow the communists didn't get the same bashing. And I was like, it was the same. They were doing essentially the same thing, the same kind of evil. And the results, the outcomes were the same, millions dead. So they're really, their tactics are the same. They might speak different things, but they really just carry out the same evil.
They behave the same. I think there's also something dangerous, and I was thinking about what you just said about how do you pronounce your name?
Sagita.
Sagita, nice to meet you. I was thinking about what you
Nice to
said
meet
about how you were taught that they're evil, right? And here in the States, of course, we're taught, of course, Nazis are evil. But I think there's something about just learning that people were evil that helps you separate yourself from imagining yourself ever in that situation, where you just kind of look back in, I as a kid, looked back at atrocities that happened and just thought oh, those evil people, it was sort of from this elevated place of moral superiority. And I think that makes us, I was thinking about where we're at right now in society and how I think a lot of people have just imagined that we could never end up, that this could never happen. Something like this could never happen
Right.
here, happen at this time. and that those were evil people, and we're so evolved, and we're so, you know, different than them. And one of the things that, you know, I did at least learn about the evil of Nazis. I did, like you, I did not learn about the evil of what happened in the Soviet Union, of communism. We weren't taught about it in the same way. But one of the things about learning about the evil of the Nazis was that it was always presented to me as something on the right, instead of it just being presented as authoritarianism, or as what it was, which was National Socialism. And it also, I just wanted to read, I don't want to hijack this, but I wanted to read one quick thing that totally relates. This is a piece by Samuel Say. We got to interview him on the podcast for an episode Deprogrammed. And he wrote a piece called Social Justice is a Threat to Human Rights and the Gospel. He writes a lot from the Christian perspective. But he says, he talks about in 1920, this young activist who organized a public meeting in a major city inside the hall, which held hundreds of poor and underprivileged people. He delivered a speech describing how his ethnic people were oppressed and burdened, exploited and betrayed, excluded and bullied by a more privileged group. And then he goes on to quote Hitler. It was Hitler. Sorry, I gave it away. But he quotes this activist, Hitler, who said, "We do not believe that there could ever exist a state with lasting inner health if it is not built on internal social justice." And so we have joined forces with this knowledge. We realized that if this movement does not penetrate into the masses to organize them, then everything will be in vain. Then we will never be able to liberate our people, and we will never be able to think of rebuilding our country. And then I'm just going to skip on down a bit. That was Hitler. Then this is Samuel speaking again. He says, social justice was the basis for the stripping of rights away from Jews. Social justice was the basis for discrimination against Jews in the Soviet Union. Social justice was the basis for the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Social justice is the basis for South Africa's initiative to strip property rights from white farmers. Social justice is the basis for stripping a preborn baby's right to life. That last one, of course, he's making a pro-life argument there. But I think his point being, when I first read that, I got chills, because I had never learned about the Nazis as being like, as people believing they were carrying out something good, something that had to be done. You know, it was always like, these evil people, how could they do that? Well, how are these people now? When I look around me, I'm like, these people are they're pushing forward an evil belief system, my old belief system, into the world. How are they doing it? How are they getting companies and corporations to speak it? How are they getting, you know, soccer moms and churches to preach it? But they think it's something good that has to be done. They think it's to liberate people. It's mind-blowing.
Where did you
to
read
me.
that, Carrie?
It's a piece by Samuel Say, S-E-Y. We can put it in the link after the discussion. It's called Social Justice is a Threat to Human Rights and the Gospel. So he obviously writes from a Christian point of view, but it's a really great piece. Even if you're not a Christian, I would suggest you read it, because it just kind of opened my eyes a little bit about, I didn't realize Hitler talked about social justice. He did. You know, anyway, sidetrack from the book, but I think it was relevant to your point about what you learned about the Nazis. You know, it's just something about this book. And he at the beginning in his preface, when he kind of talked about how he knew he would face criticism for trying to humanize these people, and he was like, not to forgive and not to excuse, but so that we can understand, you know.
Right. Well, obviously the threat, right, is if we don't understand how it happens to ordinary men, then we're disarmed when it happens to us, right? Which is where we are right now. I don't think anyone, you know, if you go out onto the street corner right now and suggest that the radical left is in any way similar to Nazis, I think 90% of the population will laugh you off the street. They think that's ridiculous, because it doesn't seem that way. We're not like that at all. That's just the crazy left. Where, you know, we couldn't ever do that. If you use hyperbole and say, well, you know, someday Sean King is going to be asking for all of the white people to get on a boxcar, everyone thinks that's ridiculous. But, you know, I don't see us being that different from early 1930s Germany right now. Maybe we'll go through our Weimar Republic hyperinflation phase and have to deal with something like this. Like, I don't, as a backlash. So I think you're right. It totally disarms you. By the way, Sigita, I did not realize where you're from, but I wore this shirt apparently for you today. This is my communism killed 100 million people, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. So there you go.
I was gonna wear a hat or crown or something to make I feel safe in unsafe space. This is the only place I feel safe. So, but I didn't make it. But thank you for showing your T-shirt.
Carter, I bet that T-shirt makes you popular at resist rallies.
That one, and I have one with Shay's face on it with just a line through it. That one is, people love that one.
So
Yeah.
Carrie, I quickly tried to look up that article and I found the Twitter link, and Twitter has now said that the link you are trying to access has been identified by Twitter or our partners as being potentially harmful or associated with a violation of Twitter's.
Wow. Wow. They did that to my article too. I wonder if Samuel even knows that's amazing. Can you get to the link, or you have to go through an extra step to read this article?
An extra step. I had to copy and paste the link so I can see this Christian man's view of history.
Unbelievable. Wow.
And a lot of people say, oh, these extra hurdles don't violate your rights. Well, big tech and Google ads and such provide a lot of data. When you require them to copy the link and post it in a browser instead of just clicking it, when you throw up the interstitial warning of this is offensive or this is, fact checks, they know that you're cutting into 20, 30, 50, 80% of the traffic and the readers. That's why they do it. Is we're not censoring it. We're just getting in the way, knowing that we're hurting its reach.
Yep. Something else about the, in relation, back to the book in relation to the parallels between what happened in Germany and what's happening now is, we talk about this a lot, right? The large majority of people in the US aren't actually radical leftists. They kind of think it's stupid. They're just afraid. They're just afraid of being called racist or whatever. And I had not heard this quote before, but I heard it in the book for the first time. My book, it's on page 201, which is in the afterword. And he's quoting someone named Kershaw. And he said, "The road to Auschwitz was built by hatred, but paved with indifference." And that quote just really, really resonated with me, because I don't think Antifa and the radical left they're not really the problem fundamentally. Like, yes, they're evil, but the problem is all the indifference and all the people who are going to not say anything and let them march right into Washington or our universities.
Even though the Nazis did get in by voting, it said in the book that at the peak it was 37% was all that supported it.
Right, it wasn't a majority. Yep.
Not been a majority.
Well, there are some that just make it palatable, almost fashionable, and make a conscious choice to follow that ideology. And then others feel as if they're somehow in the wrong if they don't say something, or, I don't know what draws people into it. But the majority is really just bystanders, kind of like in the book too. Just standing aside, even those who didn't participate in the atrocities or the killings, they kind of stood aside, almost feeling innocent, like they didn't do anything wrong.
Right. I wasn't the guy who pulled the trigger. I was the guy who, guarded this thing over here. It's like, okay, well, yeah.
And they took, as far as ordinary men, they took mostly policemen. They're like city policemen, mostly from Hamburg, and got them to do that. And something that's a little scary is when the war was over, almost all of them went back to being policemen in Hamburg.
Yeah, and a lot of them, I know, like when he mentioned what their jobs were, because they were reserve policemen, so a lot of them were had other jobs. So it would say, this police officer, a barber, or this police officer, an accountant, and it's like, and a dentist, it's just something mind blowing to imagine you know, this dentist who's killing people. I don't know. It just
Yeah, and actually, it's, I mean, some of them even cited their jobs as reasons why they were like could not. They got away with not actually doing shooting. Like, well, I didn't have to worry about a career in the police because I had my other business to go to, so I could sit back and just, you know, lead people to the grave, but not shoot, right? And that was their moral justification, I guess, or their practical justification.
And he does repeatedly mention that it was a random cross section, but I don't think that's a random cross section. Like people who volunteer to be police or join the police force or even a reserves, that's not a random selection. Like that's
well, his
people who are
argument,
willing.
no, but his argument was it was random because it got you out of the draft, and I think that does massively randomize it, right? Right. I would agree with you normally, but like I was thinking about that. I'm like, if there was a draft and I've got a kid and a wife. If there was a draft and they're like, you can be a policeman where you'll probably get to stay home, or you have to go fight on or you can be drafted. I might be like, I'll be a cop, right? They didn't know they were going to get deployed to Poland. They were supposed to be kind of staying in Germany, right? I mean, I might not actually, but a lot of people might make that decision of like, I'm going to hedge my bets here, right? I'm going to be sucked into this war one way or another. I might as well do it in the safe, a quote, safe route.
And I was struck by how quickly the mindset changed, because some of the Jews were fighting alongside in World War I, with them in World War I. And then 20 years later in 1960s, it was unthinkable that they could have had that mindset to look at the Jews the way they did. And that was a 40 year span of how quickly things changed. And of course, now with our modern technology, things can change within 3 days. It's astounding to me.
It's chilling. You're right. The time elapsed is not very long, you know.
And it seemed like the Nazi leadership was aware of the generational differences between attitudes when they were trying to figure out who should be doing this and who should be doing that. I think they seemed pretty aware, like, oh, these kids grew up, so they're going to be more indoctrinated. They grew up in this time, and these other people are going to have a harder time doing this stuff. So
yeah, the Hitler Youth. Well, look, who are we indoctrinating right now? Who's leading this? They're always talking about the youth are leading this movement. Who's leading SJW ideology right now? It's the youth, because we've indoctrinated them, and now we're indoctrinating them at an even younger age into this belief system. So who knows where we're going to be at when the people who are now the kids who are like in kindergarten, first and third, second grade right now, those kids, what's going to happen when they're the leaders?
Yeah, in 30 years, I shudder to think what they'll do.
He did say that the younger people were more interested in the killing and in improving their situation in this police battalion. He also said that a lot of the people who joined up for this were, I can't remember exactly how he put it. I only read about 15% of the book, to be honest with you. He said that they did not, they did not have their own businesses. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of the people on the left, they don't have their own businesses. They work for other people. Most of the people I know on Facebook have their own businesses or have some kind of an interest in what they do. So I think that made a difference then, and I think it makes a difference now.
You're
right. They're not creating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that the police demographics of the population they were using was very similar to our current one of it's local guys with a high school or slightly better education, and it was dominated by guys in the 30s and 40s with kids. And then they bring in the ideologues in their 20s who were pure believers and went, this is your new diversity training seminar, and the true believers are going to be the new heads of the department because they're so much more educated than you.
You know, just to underscore this point that this can kind of happen anywhere. And like, I think we tend to, I don't know if it's just Americans generally, but I think we tend to think that like, oh, look what those communists did in Russia. Look what Pol Pot did. Look what Mao did. Look what those Germans did. If you read about World War I mean, just read 1418, or even if you read other losses, we Europeans were pretty horrible and atrocious. Like, we did some absolutely disgusting, horrific things to people. Like, it is not unique to one culture. This is as long as you've got a culture that is susceptible to obeying authority and conformity, you can accomplish quite a lot. Like, yeah, there's cool stories about World War I where people don't fire shots, and there's kind of stories about camaraderie, soccer games between opposing sides, but there's also some pretty horrible slaughter of women and children and innocents, and it happens on both sides. It's not just the enemy doing that. I think it's important to be aware of our own capacity for evil.
Yeah, the idea that it can't happen to Americans is wrong. Like, they brought up the Lai Massacre in Vietnam, where like 100 U.S. servicemen killed like 500 people, mostly women. They raped them, women, children. They just shot them in ditches. It's exactly the same.
Yep.
And nobody stopped them, except for there was one guy landed his helicopter and rescued some, and they ostracized him for doing that. It could happen to Americans.
It has happened. Yeah.
It's so devastating. No, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I thought it was pretty telling when I read the book at the beginning, the first time the Reserve Police Battalion was offered the opportunity to step away, like Carter was saying, right? They were told, hey, we're going to do this. If somebody is not able to do it, step out. Now, at that time, they probably didn't know that nothing was going to happen to them, right? The other thing I remember is that a lot of these guys they had not been indoctrinated like maybe the younger people, because they were an older group. So it shows you how easy it was after the first time they started participating in this, how they assumed that mentality, and they, like you said, moral authority wasn't their own anymore. They're like, yep, they told me to do this. I'm almost like an extension of the leader or the head who's telling me that I have to do this. And they sort of they didn't think about it. I mean, this book should be something that every person today should read, because we cannot forget that this type of thing can happen. And like you said, right now, people don't believe that something like this can happen. And that's the thing that can really be very, very dangerous. How history repeats itself.
Yeah.
So
Manu, can I just say something quickly? Manny, nice to meet you, Manny.
Nice to meet you too.
Something about that, like you said, how they kind of got inured to it after the first time it became normal for them. The really abnormal became normal. But did anyone else notice, like, just how often in the detailed part of the book where it gave all the dates and all the different massacres, and just how often it talked about how drunk they were getting all the time, and they would bring alcohol? Because how do you deal with that? It's like you just check out, like so many of them just getting wasted. And
it's a way to deal with cognitive dissonance, right? Is to check out. Absolutely. But the other thing that I wanted to point out, though, is that it didn't, and I think this to me is quite fascinating. It was something that Milgram touched on, and I think it was in this book as well. They don't just get callous to the behavior. They start, in order to make themselves feel better morally, they have to start telling themselves a narrative that the person deserved it. And it becomes easier and easier because, well, I did it before. If they didn't deserve it, that makes me a bad person. So they must have deserved it. So therefore they deserve it now in the future. And like, it's a self-perpetuating, you spiral into this really, really evil mentality where you believe that what you're doing is righteous. And it might have started with, I'm not so sure, I feel pressure, I did it, now I have to justify it. And that just that's a slippery slope that just leads you to,
But and it's
enjoying
almost
it.
we're going the opposite direction here, because they had to rationalize doing something they knew was bad, and look how far they went with the violence. Today, there's no rationalization. They believe already that they're doing something good. So imagine how much further you can go if you're not trying to rationalize something you know is bad, as opposed to first starting off on a high horse.
And
that's a scary thought, Thomas.
It is. It is.
Sorry.
But the normalizing of it, like the honeymooner, You know, the pregnant wife who wanted to watch, that was very disturbing. And then the entertainment group, the singers and actors that begged to be part of it,
Yes.
to let us have a turn. I can't even fathom that part of it. The other part too that I just wanted to mention before is the one guy, Hoffman, with the stomach problems. I got stomach problems from reading this book. So can you imagine if he had any conscience whatsoever? It really just it destroyed his health. And that's, I mean, I guess that says something about him. But he, you know, I don't know.
But he
it was all
subsequently,
interesting.
like, he didn't like that. He didn't want his conscience, right? Because he subsequently then, like, rose to prominence and was very successful in the military.
Yeah, he was a very strange case. I took notes on that. He was such a different case. You know, he was always saying how, you know, oh no, don't take me off the job. I'm all in it. And then he wouldn't participate. So what was going on there? He was very different from all the others.
What was interesting was his illness was bad enough that he probably could have gotten a medical exemption where they said, we're going to remove you from active duty because I don't know if it's irritable bowel syndrome or ulcerative colitis or some parasitic digestive tract worms. I don't know. But he could have gotten a medical exemption to get out of it and didn't.
But he always took to bed whenever they were getting ready to do something. So, you know, and then everybody started noticing that. So I don't know. And I think I wrote down it was vegetative colitis. I've never heard of that. That's really kind of interesting. Maybe he couldn't eat vegetables. I don't know.
Well, it's funny. I think it said afterwards when, you know, he kept insisting it wasn't fake, and they thought it was fake. Like, what do you call it when you're faking an illness in the military?
Like
Hypochondria.
Yeah.
Hypochondria.
No, there's something. There's a different term we use.
Munchausen's. No,
that's it's like a section something when you do that. I don't know what it is.
A military term.
Yeah. But when he got to the next unit, didn't he get back to normal and do a wonderful job in the next spot? So I think it was directly related to what he knew was wrong, but he didn't want to be derelict of his duty.
He hid it. He didn't want his officers above him to know. He didn't want the men below him to know. He actually wanted to be able to do it, but physically couldn't. And if I remember right, they said later in his career was he successful. He went to the Russian front and he became a leader in like the military, where now they're shooting military people. That's a totally different story.
Yeah, his bowels don't act up for that. But by the way, can I really quickly thank Ken Libson, who just gave us a super chat. We can't put super chats up on the screen because we're using Zoom right now for book club, but I want to shout out and say thank you anyway. Sorry, go ahead, whoever was going to speak.
I noticed a lot of the guys were quoting I don't want to let my teammates, my tribe, my friends down. So they were joining in even though they had reservations. It wasn't just hiding in the anonymity of the mob, but I'm loyal to my friends. It's not fair to do it and not be involved. And then some of and at other times they would cover for each other with, you shot one or two and then you went and hid by the trucks and I'll cover for you. So there was a lot of protecting each other as long as you're helping each other. But when one of the guys was trying not to, and the ideologue says, make the ones who weren't shooting shoot. And some of the guys shot their first Jew, and one of the guys steadfastly refused. And it was only that top officer who had given them the initial choice who protected him from the consequences, but he got socially ostracized. And it's like, we're all doing this nasty, dirty work. I'm going to hate you because you're not helping and joining in. And they were playing off of the friendship and camaraderie for the nefarious purposes.
They talked about the social ostracism and peer pressure and being part of the group as being more important than the orders. That's what the author talked about, like that was a major factor, that just you're in a group of buddies and you have to go along with what everybody's trying to do.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that he pointed out that even the people who didn't participate or avoided participation as quote much as they could, um, they didn't do it on. They didn't like voice moral concerns. They accepted the classification as weak, right? They knew that because of the peer pressure, they would be viewed as weak stomached. And instead of saying, no, I'm just morally opposed to killing Jews who are innocent,
Right.
they couldn't even make that argument. They just were like, yeah, I'm weak. I'm gonna be over here sweeping or whatever they were doing.
Yeah, I saw that, Carter. That what you're saying is that I have a section that I had highlighted, and I think what happened with those guys is they obviously didn't want to conform to that, but they were not strong enough to sort of say, I'm not going to do this. And so they were not challenging the other people who were. They said, oh, I'm too weak, I can't do it. They were sort of downgrading themselves in front of everybody else, so they weren't, challenging them, and that's what they did. And the scary part is how something so horrible has happened to the point when individually, each one of them probably at the beginning thought, this is horrible, we shouldn't be doing this. They eventually justified it little by little, and they ended up killing millions of people. When individually they thought it was a bad thing, but at one point they basically let go of their personal values, right? And they conformed to whatever the leadership was telling them to do. And then at the end, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, just to play on what you were saying, it was also easier for them when they didn't have to look at an individual Jewish person in the face before they killed them. They found it easier when it was removed, where they all lined up and shot, instead of being assigned one person, and then you talk to that person, maybe you learn something about them. That to me speaks to the anonymous kind of mob nature of how it's easy to go after people right now online as part of this anonymous mob, and to behave in ways towards an individual that you wouldn't behave if you were sitting face to face with them at dinner. You wouldn't treat them the same way you do online. It's that losing your personality, like you said, like losing your personal values, so to speak.
And that tracks the Milgram experiment like pretty directly, right? When there was 4 versions of the original experiment. One, the target person was in a room and they couldn't speak. They could pound on the wall, but that was it. And you had very high compliance, torturing them all the way on that example. Then there was the example you couldn't see them, but you could hear them. Compliance went down a little bit. Then there was an example where you could see them. They were in the same room with you. Compliance went down even further. And then there was an example actually where you had to hold their hand down on the shock pad to force them to get shocked. And still 20% of the people complied, but that was the lowest number. And that speaks to exactly what you're saying, Carrie, which is like that face-to-face interaction, or like the closer you are to your victim, the harder it is to inflict pain.
And the Nazis learned after the first massacre, like where they had the cops were assigned to a Jew, and then they walked them into the woods and then shot him. And they said, "Oh, that's a bad way to do it." And they slowly worked their way up the gas chambers. So that's why it worked much better when they had people bring them into the woods, and then someone else shoots them. So they bring them into the woods, lay them down, and they shoot them in the back of the neck. Like, you don't even make eye contact, let alone talk to them. It makes it faceless.
Yeah. And one of the things that I was thinking was like this plus the Milgram stuff. Like, I was just thinking, if you are an evil authoritarian, there's a blueprint for how to make sure how to maximize compliance, right? And make sure you set up a certain culture and certain procedures, and remove the victims in this way and split the orders up among different people. And like it's a dark science, but the information is there.
Maybe we shouldn't be talking about this in public. They might treat it as an instruction manual.
Unfortunately, I think they already know.
Yeah, I think that since it seems that the natural inclination for people is to go in one of these directions, I think Brett Weinstein, and I think Carrie, you shared the thing about the groups and hunting the witches. Like, there's basically few different types of people that end up in certain situations. And I think that's the benefit of reading something like this, because all the people here on this panel probably would fall into some of those different groups. And I know I probably would fall into one of the groups, maybe a group that I don't want to be a part of. But if I have a better understanding of what those groups are and what has happened, I can better recognize it and even work against my own inclination to do a wrong thing as well.
That's
You know-
exactly right.
Go ahead.
Mhm.
Well,
Okay.
one of the things we need to do is to avoid getting sucked into the demonization of our opponents. That really seems to be the key thing, is once you've decided that those people are so bad or they are so destructive that they have to be completely wiped out. I mean, and I can feel that in myself sometimes when I start seeing these thugs rioting, and I'm almost cheering for a semi to just plow through and send them all over the place, because I just get to the point where it's almost like I've lost sight of the fact that those are individual people. Most of them are probably teenagers or 20 somethings, dumb as mud, have no real appreciation for what they're doing. But I feel myself getting mad enough that I'd almost cheer somebody on that was going after them, you know, and I have to pull back and learn not to dehumanize them.
Yes. That's the difference, I think, between someone who's trying to live consciously and someone who's just possessed by ideology or emotions or passions or what have you, because it's like I was saying earlier about at the very beginning, a lot of the people I think who believe what I used to believe, my old belief system, I don't think, based on my experience when I was preaching that stuff, I don't think there's a lot of self-reflection there, and there's not what Jordan Peterson would call like acknowledging your shadow and getting to know your shadow self so that you can fight against your shadows. It's like if you don't have any acknowledgement or awareness of the fact that every human is capable of evil and that you're capable of evil, if you're not aware of that and you think of yourself as like this truly good, this is why Carter and I have a disagreement where I say I don't believe that people are good or bad. I just think we're all capable of both, and some of us live in one place more than the other. But
Hold on, we need to clarify.
Okay.
I don't think anyone's pure evil or pure good. I just think it's
Right.
appropriate linguistically to say so-and-so is evil. If they've 98% of what they do is evil, you can say that without worrying about walking back your words and like, I don't want to call him evil. Like,
Well,
it's a shortcut to be like, Hitler's evil. Yeah, maybe he was really nice to the waiter one time. It doesn't matter. Like, in general, we can throw him in the evil camp. That's fine.
I know what you're saying. I think it's just more of a self it's a boundary for me personally, because like is it Kristen was saying, I don't, or Christine, I don't want to get to the Christina, sorry. I don't want to get to the point where it's just really easy for me to demonize people who believe what I used to believe and just think of them as evil. I do believe they're being possessed by an evil belief system, and I believe they are doing evil in the world, but I think a lot of them are, they think they truly believe they're doing good. Like Thomas was saying earlier, it's almost scarier than this, because this particular manifestation of this ideology is I think it's more dangerous than anything we've seen yet, because it has effectively convinced so many people that it's good, that, you know, it's somehow they weaponized defense. They took everything that it wasn't, and they managed to create this mantle and this mask. That's what it is. It is what it isn't, right? It is this good, moral, anti-racist, anti-sexist, all for equality, and it's none of those things. It's the exact opposite, but it's done such a good job of selling itself as that. So it's almost scarier to me than what Hitler was pushing, because it, you know, people are bought into it and believe, you know, this is their moral belief system for a lot of people, that this is how they show they're a good person, is by preaching this stuff.
Well, keep in mind, though, I mean, well, first of all, I want a clip of Christina saying dumb as mud so that I can play it over and over again in the right circumstances. But keep in mind, it's hard for us to try and empathize or like understand what Germans in Nazi Germany were thinking and feeling, and you can get blamed for being a sympathizer for doing that. I think actually the author even mentioned this. Like, no, the idea is to understand them, and I think part of the understanding is they believed they were doing good as well. You know, Laura Higgins in chat just said to me, "Well, Carter's judging people based on their works." Yes, that's what I'm judging you based on. That's what you should judge people based on, not what they intend. Many of the Nazis intended good. They felt like they were doing good. They were completely wrong. They felt like the Jews were evil and they needed to be wiped off the face of the earth and blah, blah, blah. But those were all moral beliefs. They believed this as morally good, just like many people on the left believe that all white people are inherently evil and whiteness is a sin and should be like, it's the same thing. So I don't think it's helpful to say like, well, in our case, we have people who are morally convinced. They were all morally convinced. They all had a moral argument. That's what you use to justify. That's why you justify.
No, I
things.
think they had a moral. I said that earlier. I do think they had a moral argument. That's why I said it's good to look back at it. I'm just saying now, like Thomas said earlier, the moral argument is even more advanced now.
Oh,
like these
totally,
people,
totally
it was
agree with
hard
both of
for
you
them.
on that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It was hard for them to do this and to justify this. They had to get shit-faced drunk, a lot of these guys. But now it's evolved, it's advanced to the degree where, like Thomas was saying, it almost scares me about how much easier it would be to get people who buy into the ideology today to do some of this.
Well, the good people in the ideology, I think, the good left, I'm using good in quotes, but the well-meaning people joining the leftist crazy train, they're the people who get drunk, right? They're the people who shoot you, but get drunk afterwards. It doesn't really help, but you know what? Can I read a quote? This is not from the book, but then I'm going to read a quote from the book. This quote is from, I know you guys have probably seen this. Project Veritas did this undercover thing, and they had I think it was one of Bernie Sanders' field organizers. His name was Kyle Jurek. Kyle Jurek said, so the journalist prompted him. The journalist said, guys like that, and he meant liberals. Liberals, what are we going to do with liberals, basically? And Jurek responded, gulag. And then, with a laugh, he said, liberals get the fucking wall first. That's what he said. Now, that mentality, to me, is exactly the mentality. Look at how Nazi Germany, there was a spot in this book, I think on my book it was page 180, where they listed the three main threats that were identified to Nazi Germany. Now, one of them was Marxism. Obviously, they were fighting the Marxists, fine. But the other two you will recognize as shared with the left. Here's the quote. The main threat of healthy awareness of the need for territorial expansion and racial purity came from doctrines propagating the essential equality of mankind. The threat was doctrines propagating the essential equality. They threw Marx into that because he claims equality, right? Even though he's a collectivist. The first such doctrine was Christianity, spread by the Jew Paul. The second was liberalism, emerging from the French Revolution, the uprising of the racially inferior, instigated by the Jew-ridden Freemasons. So I see the left now, and it's like, oh, your two big enemies, Christianity and liberalism. Those are your big enemies. In fact, you're saying liberals get the wall first. This is their message. There's very little daylight between the positions of the Nazis and the radical left right now.
No, and one thing I was also thinking about along with what Carrie was saying, and if this is your belief system and it's almost like a religion to you, what happens if something comes up and you have to move outside of America? You have no more religion because you're living in a country where you may not be the majority population. So what would happen if a white liberal SJW moved to Japan? What would they do with their lives? What would they fight against? And that's
a great question.
I mean, it trips me out because it's like, if you have a belief system, you should be able to hold that belief system on Mars. But if your belief system suddenly changes based on the fact that you're in a different country or maybe even in a different neighborhood, I can imagine having a belief system that is so shallow that it's dependent on the nation in which you live.
Do you think they might recognize then that a lot of what they call white privilege is majority privilege if they were living in Japan.
Yeah, someone mentioned that. It made me think that because, I mean, if you cross the whole racism and power argument, if you cross the tracks and you're a white person who is now in a majority minority, you know what I'm saying, neighborhood, do you suddenly have no ability to be racist because you are now amongst a group of people who outnumber you and have literal power over you? Like, how does that work? I mean, we can do that neighborhood to neighborhood across different railroad tracks, much less outside of a country. So how your belief system is predicated on where you happen to be standing right now.
I actually think that they would hold fast to the white European Christian hetero cis males bad philosophy, no matter where they are. I think it's difficult to have that. I've spent a lot of time in Japan. I think you've been there as well. Like, it's difficult to be a white guy in Japan and think that white privilege is everywhere in the world, because it's certainly not in Japan. But I think they're generally just wanting to tear down the West. And actually there are the same people in Europe. There's a lot of European nations with the same the same Marxist revolutionary ideology. So I don't know. I think maybe they would be in Japan and still be yelling about Trump. Like they'd be yelling about Orange Man bad from Tokyo.
I mean, I think they would be. There's white SJWs in South Africa, in Johannesburg, protesting George Floyd, walking around with Black Lives Matter shirts. What white is 8% of the population? Like, how do you get people to do that there?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that in South Africa, I don't know, it kind of fell off my radar, but I know that there was a movement to appropriate the lands of the white farmers there, which sounded very much like what happened to the Kulaks and what happened to the Gujarati in the Congo, I think, to where they started pushing those middlemen minorities out of the economy. And I happened to see something recently where there were people lined up for food in South Africa. So I don't know how far they've gone with that or what's going on, if they've actually gone as far as appropriating that land and now are running out of food because the farmers are gone and not farming anymore. But it seems like some of that same pattern is happening down there.
Keith, do you know? I know you know a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, they're well down that, Thomas. They've been taking over white farms and handing them to Black people, and the majority of them fail. It's difficult to farm there. So that's been going on for 2 decades or so in South Africa. It's a very, look at it like Kerry always says, you can't fight racism with racism. Like, South Africa is entirely fighting the apartheid racism with way more racism. It's just Black against white now.
Well, the saddest thing about all of it is that we know from history and we witness the horrors over and over, and we can learn and we study the psychology and all of it, and we're still repeating the same thing. It's just like, can't stand it.
If you want not to there's disturbing parts of this book, but if you want to be super disturbed and you're interested in South Africa, there's a book that I read recently that I actually I think I put it down several times because it was so disturbing. It's called Kill the Boer. It's about the farm attacks, and the level of brutality in South Africa right now is it's worse than what you're reading about in Ordinary Men. Just leave it at that.
Renata just said that Boer is farmer in Afrikaans.
Right.
So I'll tell you some of what I know is because my girlfriend lived there for 33 years, like born and raised there. And she left about 10 years after Mandela took over because of what was happening. And now she's saying the same thing that Carter said on the last episode about China. Like, she wants to leave again. She's like, this looks exactly like South Africa looked in like the late 80s when she was in high school. Like, this is getting scary. And she's like, I'm like, I don't want to give up yet. I don't want to give up yet. She's like, we're going to move to Portugal. We got to get out of here now. I see this coming.
Preferably, we all move to a state somewhere. I want to thank 2A Self-Defense Law, by the way, who just super chatted us. And I'm going to read her super chat, or his. I actually don't know the gender. Good conversation. I'm sorry I cannot join the conversation on Zoom. It keeps saying that my email is bad. My belief system is thankful for this group of individuals. We'll figure out your Zoom later, but next time you can join the chat. But
Hey, my Zoom completely had kicked off for a while. Have we talked about how we've got this whole ministry of propaganda with Google and CNN and MSNBC, who are basically the propaganda arm of the Marxists and the identitarians in the US right now? And there are people who believe that Rayshard Brooks was just sleeping in his car in the Wendy's parking lot and the cops just walked up and
you broke up at the end, but to answer your question, we haven't really, I think Tamara alluded to it a little bit, but we haven't really talked about that too much, but it's a great point because this is the thing that, this is the thing with fascism, and I'm going to compare our current system to moving in a fascist direction and a fascist / oligarchical direction rather than a pure socialist direction. In pure socialism or pure communism, the media is literally owned by the state, right? Like in the Soviet Union, you had the KGB, and then you had some organizations that like pretended to be neutral, but they're kind of controlled by the KGB and everyone knew it. And like everything was kind of literally owned by the government. But in a fascist or in more of an oligarchy, you have the pretense of private ownership, but you have everyone ideologically aligned with the government, right? And Google and Facebook and Twitter, and you don't need to look any farther than my wife just brought this up this morning, something about the guys that were, remember the 2 doctors that were banned from YouTube because they disagreed, they were California doctors. I mean, think about it. I said this to her. She was asking about it. And I said, oh, yeah, they were banned from YouTube because they went against the government narrative. And I realized, well, wait a minute. Like, that's true. It wasn't YouTube's narrative. I mean, it was, but it was the government narrative. And YouTube explicitly was like, well, we believe the WHO and we're going to follow the WHO narrative. And like, if you go against that narrative, we ban you. So you don't actually need private companies to be explicitly owned by the state in order to be in bed enough with the state for quote rational reasons. Like there's practical reasons why they have to obey the state, and they want business, they want the right kind of regulations, they want to be left alone. They don't like the state has a lot of power. Culture's gone that way, but I think it's a huge concern, Christina, and actually I think it's one of the scariest things because I don't know. They control all the zombies, like all that silent majority that's paving the road to Auschwitz. They're directed by all those companies that you just mentioned.
We just got the mandate for mask wearing. This is sort of making me think of that. So everyone has to wear the mask, and they're putting the onus on businesses. It's not like they're going to arrest you. In fact, you have a list that you don't even have to show proof of, but the businesses won't let you in if you don't have one. And I'm thinking this is just training us to get to the point where this vaccine, I know I'm getting into weird territory, but this vaccine, which has not been tested very well, for very long, is going to then become, the businesses, you won't be able to travel, you won't be able to do A, B, or C. And it's not that it's the government's rule or the government mandating it. It's they're putting it on the businesses to expect you to have it so you can do any of these various things. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg of what will be coming on down the line. Maybe I'm paranoid, but there you go.
No, I think
I agree.
It's I just want to say it's not that the businesses are doing it. It's still a government mandate, but they're using businesses to be the police because they know it's not enforceable. There's just not enough police. But if they start they get the health department to like come down on a restaurant if they
Right.
don't follow it. Like they're trying to pit business owners against their customers as if they're police. That's an evil way.
And that is, yeah, and that's what the restaurateurs around me that I've seen say, you know, it's now on us. It's on us, and we have to enforce this because the government's not going to. But if we don't, we will be shut down. You know, and it's a slippery slope.
Think about what
Keith
this
is
does
right. They're basically
psychologically.
deputizing everyone, right? They're deputizing the entire health department, businesses. They're outsourcing police.
Well, think about what this does to people psychologically too, because I think it does a couple things. On the one hand, like you said, Carter, they're deputizing people almost to turn other people in. And I was on a thread on Instagram yesterday where there's this small shop. It's a tea shop in Seattle where apparently the owner had posted a sign saying no masks allowed. I don't want you to wear your mask in my shop, with medical exceptions, of course, but he was trying to encourage no mask wearing. And instead of just not going there, like on the flip side, if a store says you must wear a mask, and if let's say I'm a person who's opposed to that, well, I just wouldn't go there. And instead of just not going there, a mob formed. They've bullied him online, hundreds of abusive messages. They've contacted every shop in Seattle that he distributes tea and coffee to, and two at least that I know of have denounced him now and are no longer going to do business with him. And the comments from people in the threads were just, it's like what you talked about earlier, Manny, about like when people get kind of used to a certain behavior, it's not normal at first, but then it becomes normalized. So there's all these people in the thread who are acting as some kind of authority, like police, and they're in there saying like, just put on your effing mask. You know, it's like, whoa, dude, like, why are you here bothering that? Just don't go to his shop. Why do you care? It's one little small business. But this desire to all pile on and say, we're going to force this on you. We think this is moral and you're immoral for not doing it. You know, it really freaks me out. So psychologically, on the one hand, I think it's turning some people into little authoritarian enforcers who are getting off on escalating, controlling behavior over others. There's a councilwoman here in my little town who has been calling the cops on businesses that she counts the people who go in, and she calls the cops if they go over the 50% capacity. But she fought against us being able to reopen in the first place. But once she was outvoted, then it's like, well, I'm going to call the cops. So there's some people I think it's psychologically, it's turning them into little Nazis. But then on the other hand, psychologically looking at people wearing masks all the time, I wonder about this when I see it. So I hate it. And it depersonalizes it depersonalizes humanity. And so yesterday outside of my local coffee shop, there's a group of women, they're all wearing masks. And I believe fully you do what makes you feel safe. I don't judge you for wearing it. I'm just saying that looking at it, America looks different to me now. And so there was a group of women wearing masks, and one of them had a face shield on, and my boyfriend he used to live in Korea. He's like, this looks so much like Korea. Everywhere we go now looks like Korea, where everyone's wearing the mask all the time, and now even the face shields, which were pretty popular there. And there's something about that. I think I don't know what the effects are yet, but I think collectively the way that it's affecting us to just see people as kind of sanitized and removed and don't touch people and don't, there's something about that helps us to dehumanize one another, I think.
Can I just say one thing? I have a son who is very introverted, and he is in college, and he said this is just putting another level of social anxiety on all of us. He said, not, certainly the people who are more outgoing, but also people who are introverted. He goes, that's just one more level I have to get past in order to interact with people. I find it very disturbing that you can't smile at people in the grocery store because they can't tell if you're smiling. I just pull my mask down and start smiling at them. I'm just like, I can't not connect with people. I've always done it. I always get the strange feeling I'm about to rob the store when I pull it back up. I don't know. It's just so.
It does make you feel like a bandit, right? To have pull your mask down. But Carrie, the first point you made was about their masks, like getting people to be a little authoritarians, like kind of policing people. And I think actually that's actually that's a minor first step to that slippery slope I talked about earlier, where like once you've done something bad to one person, then you have to justify that they deserved it and therefore you can do more next time. I think actually they're starting that path well before being asked to execute someone. They're starting them on that path way, way back. Like, oh, first just condemn them morally, first destroy their business. And then people are going to rationalize, well, I just shut that person's business down, or I just caused a mob to go after them. I would be a bad person if they didn't deserve it. So they must deserve it. So now, they're ready to take that next step the next time that this comes up. And I think the depersonalization thing, I mean, obviously masks depersonalize. A lot of communication is through facial expressions.
Exactly.
Those are gone. And the other thing that they do is, humans are both threats and assets. Like they're like, you need humans in a society. You need to have love and interaction and just regular old trade and communication, but they could also kill you. They could be carrying a parasite. Like humans are both. And I think one of the things that the masks does is really emphasizes humans as a threat. It really others people, to use the social justice, like it others people and it puts you in this mentality of, oh, instead of meeting someone and like wanting to shake their hand and getting to know them, every person is perceived as a threat. And that becomes much easier later when you're asked to mistreat someone. Well, everyone's a threat to me. So it's easy to justify that you need to mistreat someone. I think you're spot on.
Yeah. Do we have any Seinfeld fans here?
I know which clip you're
watched
talking
it.
about, I think.
Yeah. So it reminded me so much of an old Seinfeld episode where Kramer went for a walk for AIDS, and he's walking with everybody, and he doesn't feel like wearing a ribbon. And these two men call him out, ends up getting beat up in the alley because he won't wear the ribbon, even though he's there walking with them. And that reminds me of all this stuff, to where that whole conformity. And then it also reminded me something really weird that I picked up on in the book. For me, it was page 166, where I was talking about the F scale and all that. And one of the things that the personality traits that they assigned to some of these people was an exaggerated concern with sexuality. I read Dinesh D'Souza's book about the Big Lie, and he goes through parts of what the brown shirts did. And for some reason, the brown shirts were the like the Antifa of the Nazi. They went around beating people up. For some reason, there were a lot of gay men in the brown shirts. And I probably can get, canceled for even bringing this up. But what is it about an increased concern with sexuality, the F scale, and what we saw with some of those brown shirts and making people wear AIDS ribbons? Is there a connection there? I have no idea. I don't know enough psychology behind any of that. But that theme keeps coming up when I keep reading these things.
Did anybody ever see Jojo Rabbit?
Not yet.
I highly recommend it. It is a satire, and it is a precious story in the end, but it is about but that is part of it. Thomas is a character who is a gay brown shirt, and he actually has a very important role. But I recommend it for everyone, especially it's a little bit lighthearted if it can be during that time of history. All of us watched it. We with some hesitation, I must say, because it is quite satirical at first, but I would recommend it.
I don't want to sound like a prude, because I'm not a prude, but I think part of the obsession with sexuality is, I think it's an intentional tearing down of values, because it's, if you look at how do I want to say this? Okay, people are viewed as people are viewed much more as animals. So they want to turn off thinking and they want you to view people as animals. And a way to view an animal is like you have drives, right? You're driven by your sexual desires and your desire for food and your desire for X, Y, and Z. And there's no expectation that an animal curbs any emotional desires and acts on some higher moral plane. An animal just goes out and ruts in the field and, you know, tears after whatever rabbit they want and eats it or whatever. That's how animals behave. And I think there's something inherent in a lot of these ideologies, partly because if you don't believe in individualism, then what value do people have as individuals? Like none, right? People are just members of the collective. They're fodder for the collective. And I think there's something about getting people to accept that is viewing people as animals. And so you have to really take any sexually, quote, deviant behavior and spotlight it as like a look at how these people are having sex in a way that you might not approve of, or you might think it's weird, or just even highlighting hedonism, right? Highlighting hedonism as a way to view other people as hedonistic animals, because while all that stuff is, I'm not prude, hedonism is bad. Hedonism is not a good philosophy. It doesn't lead to happiness at the end. It's not a moral philosophy to just be a hedonist, right? And so I wonder if some of that is just their way to like take a jab at kind of traditional values. Remember, Christianity is one of their targets. I don't know.
Thoughts on
I know
this.
that's not very articulate, but does anyone have any thoughts there?
I have a lot. Well, I kind of think that it's for me, I've mentioned this to you before, Carter, but it makes me think of of Augustine and a lecture that I heard about freedom and how in culture we are sold this idea currently that freedom is about like no boundaries. But the problem with no boundaries is it's like with postmodernism, anything goes. And so you're in this endless, constant pursuit of something that can't be attained. It's almost like, so with hedonism, I view it as, with hedonism, it's almost like you can never reach, you're in pursuit of something that can't be found, and you're compelled to continue pushing the boundaries. And whereas in the lecture I heard, he talked about Christianity being the boundaries from which you could have like greater freedom within boundaries. Almost like, think of it this way, and I don't know if I'm explaining well. Think of an artist. Okay, so the artists who have the greatest talent have, whether you're talking about a musician or someone who's painting, they've learned how to create art within rules and structure and boundaries. And those rules and structure allow their talent to come forth and to create incredible things. When you remove those boundaries and rules, then you get stuff like Jackson Pollock, where it's just, let me just splatter paint everywhere and, you know, pee on a picture of Christ or whatever. And that's art. And it's just constantly so the boundaries, I think, actually bring forth greater freedom and greater expressions of beauty, because you are constrained and you're having to find ways within those constraints to illustrate something. It's maybe I'm
no,
still
you know what I should have said?
like-
I should have used the word personal responsibility. Because a lot of their obsession is not just with sexuality, or it's consequence-free behavior. It's they want to absolve you of, because with freedom only works with responsibility. You
Right.
can't have freedom without responsibility. If you can't take personal responsibility for your actions, your freedom is self-destructive. And so I think they're trying to move everyone into these two camps where, like, you can behave free as long as you don't accept any personal responsibility, and let's highlight that and try and get people to do that. Or you can accept our non-freedom. That's the other way you can go. Those are the allowable ways to go.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure about that, but one thing about the hedonism is that, and this goes to what Thomas was saying about an obsession with sexuality. I think that hedonism is one thing that people in my world, when I was in SJW, definitely pursued, and I would say, in my opinion, they put it in the place of God. So whether that was sexual pursuits or drugs and drinking, just taking things to the excess. And getting kinkier and kinkier. It was kind of seen as a badge of coolness to what is your kink, what is your fetish. Like things just got more and more outlandish with people. I mean, there was a comedian I used to represent who was a part of a kink community where, I mean, they would take her, a pretty famous comedian, and put a bag over her head and take her out naked in the street with, like, I'm just talking about really kind of degrading stuff, with like on a chain. And that was supposed to be somehow getting off on being publicly humiliated. Like just a lot of sex stuff that just kept pushing the boundaries. And I felt like I think there's some strange overlap there with this social justice ideology, because there is an absence of something positive and beautiful to worship. And so the sermon I heard today was about kind of how the study of humans, right? Are we rational beings? Some people, you know, like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Are we rational beings, or are we, there were a couple of different options he gave, but one was, are we created to worship? Are we created to think? Are we, are we here for? What is man's purpose? What is man? And so he kind of talked about how, like, if we are beings that are created to worship, that are created to take delight in the world, then if you can, from a Christian point of view, and I realize not all are going to go with me here, but just bear with me, you can take delight in something that a Christian would say you were created to take delight in, or you can take delight in all of these kind of base human small gods, like your own sexuality. You can be obsessed with the body. You can be obsessed with drunkenness or drugs, or just kind of escaping yourself. And I think that a lot of SJWs engage in that. And last thing I'll say, they do participate in that passage you were talking about, Thomas, is a great passage. It said their investigations led them to compile a list of the crucial traits of the authoritarian personality: rigid adherence to conventional values, submissiveness to authority figures, aggressiveness toward outgroups, opposition to introspection, reflection and creativity, a tendency to superstition and stereotyping, preoccupation with power and toughness, destructiveness and cynicism, the disposition to believe that wild and dangerous things go on in the world, the projection outward of unconscious emotional impulses, and exaggerated concern with sexuality. And it says they concluded that this anti-democratic authoritarian kind of person harbors strong underlying aggressive impulses, and that fascist movements allow him to project this aggression through sanctioned violence against ideologically targeted outgroups. Well, that's Antifa to a T, Thomas. I mean, it's like, the first time I saw video of Antifa with people putting on masks and they're going out and they're beating people up, and we're seeing this happening daily now in cities. They're getting off on it. These are people who they're aggressive, and this is giving them an outlet for it and saying, this is justified. Like, you can go and be aggressive in this way. And to just last little point, to take it back to the sexuality part, one of the first professors I saw on a video, this is from a couple years ago, I don't know if you guys remember this, it was a professor, an SJW professor, who was at a protest for, I think it was the Proud Boys, and she was screaming and engaging in, I think she was shoving them and engaging in violence. That woman, that college professor, SJW, in part of the Antifa mob, they found her online in her spare time when she wasn't a professor. She had a whole blog and website where she did sex videos dressed as a lobster in like a bathtub, like completely hedonistic. I know Jeanette's laughing, but just like over the top, like I think a lot of these people have like some type of really weird kink that's like taken the place of something more beautiful and meaningful for them. It's like just continually pushing the sexual envelope. Okay, that was a long rant.
Hold on. I want to, there's something, here's the problem. Hedonism requires that you do not have the ability to project and see the consequences of your behavior. The only way you can continue to be a hedonist, by the way, I'm not against, you want to have kinks and sex stuff, go do your thing. That's fine. My point is, reveling in that, reveling in a hedonistic lifestyle and making that your focus requires that you don't think. It requires that you don't think. Long-term planning is ultimately necessary. You need to see the conclusion of your ideas. If I say it's impossible to be racist against white people, I have to be able to think, how will that play out in decades? I have to be able to look long term and see the conclusion of my ideas. Hedonism is a short circuit where you do not ever consider the long term consequences of anything you do. And I think there's a reason why that's encouraged, because they don't want you, they want you to fall into a mode of never thinking things through, never thinking about the long-term consequences, whether it's how you're having sex, who you're having sex with, or whether it's shoot this person, don't worry about the long-term consequences. Like you have to live in the moment without ever being able to long-term plan. And ultimately long-term planning is that's what your reasoning mind is for. It's for long-term planning. Right? That's what it's for. It's not for figuring out the best way to have sex right now. It's for long-term planning. It's for planting your crops so you can harvest them next year. All right? Like that's what your mind is for. And they need to turn that off. And to turn it off, they need to get you to indulge sensation and not do any long-term planning. Maybe that's more clear. I'll shut up about this issue.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe that's tied into how they demonize any attempt to teach people how to escape poverty? Like if you try to teach financial responsibility to poor people, all of a sudden you're blaming the victim.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I saw something where Hitler had said something about one of the main goals is to get rid of these 10 commandments that the Jews had perpetrated on the world. And I think it's 7 out of 10 of those commandments are what you cannot do or should not do. And that restrictive nature of religion or Christianity in this specific sense is probably why people in that camp are pushing against it, because it's like, screw you. I should be able to do whatever I want. How can you tell me what not to do? Which ties into, I think, what you were saying, Carter, with hedonism, which is a form of freedom from consequences and being able to do whatever you want to do.
Thank you. I'm sorry, guys. I went on such a ramble. I had so much, and it probably didn't make a lot of sense, but thank you.
No,
I'll
it
stop
did.
talking.
It helped me understand a lot of people that I know and what they're going on. They actually also impose this on other people around them. Like, for example, I know somebody who's a total hedonist, social justice warrior. She's married to my son, and he's type 1 diabetic. He has to drink, though. He's losing his vision, but he will keep doing what the mob wants him to do. It's absolutely insane. Now I understand it because of what you said, Carrie. Thank you.
Let me do a shout out to Mary Little, who just gave us a super chat. Thank you.
Well,
Thank
the
you,
thing
Mary.
is that
That's all.
the hedonism is the only place where you have any freedom left.
Right.
Well,
You can't say what you want. You don't own anything. You don't have rights, but you're allowed to. That's a good way to look at it too, right? Like you're squeezing a balloon, like they're tightening this part of it, and they got to make room somewhere or the balloon will pop. So go ahead. Yeah.
Corn and the lobster sit in your bathtub. You'll be fine.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to a therapist about this behavior generally because it fascinates me, and the interesting thing that his opinion was about a lot of this stuff is that people that get into these, we'll just call them out of the ordinary sexual behavior, in general, fall into two camps. There's people who they usually have some trauma. Everyone has some kind of trauma from childhood usually, but they usually have some kind of issues in the past psychologically. And they use their some people are kind of aware of their issues and they're using their sexual kinks to help heal. Actually, they're trying to work through it. And they're using and they're very aware, and it's very conscious, according to this therapist. But most people apparently are just re-injuring themselves. They're replaying this psychological trauma over and over and over and over and over again in their sexual life. And as adults, sex is one of the only areas in which we are allowed to, quote, play. Like when you're a child, you play, you imagine things all the time, you do stuff all the time. When you're an adult, there's no play. You can't, if you like skip rope down the street and have a sparkler and you're 40, people will lock you up like you're insane, right? I except for Carrie will do that. But for adults, most of their play comes comes in the realm of sex, and so a lot of them they'll re-traumatize themselves over and over and over again, playing out whatever childhood issue that they've translated into their sex life. And we know a lot of people in the social. The reason I'm bringing this up is we know a lot of people in the social justice community are completely uninterested in health, like in helping their mental health. They embrace mental health issues and trauma as a badge of honor, so they're not trying to move past them. So in order to they're going to stay in that mode of just re-traumatizing themselves over and over and over again.
Did we come
Who
to
knew
an
this would
ending?
get to a tough conversation about sex?
I don't know. Thomas brought us here.
Thanks, Thomas.
Well, yeah. Interesting.
By the way, for those of you who don't
Maintain
know,
your
Thomas is the
victim
guy who writes
status.
awesome
Hell.
articles now on our Medium page. So go read Thomas's articles.
Thank you.
I wouldn't have been talking over someone. Was someone just talking? Sorry.
Now, I was just saying that part of it is that you need to embrace your inner victim. I mean, you have to keep re-victimizing yourself because nobody's going to do it for you. Yeah, you got to.
Yeah.
I think you froze up again, Christina.
so.
Sorry.
She's a victim of bad internet service.
You're a victim of bad internet service, Thomas says.
I'm pretty sure it's the patriarchy that's working against you, Christina. Sorry about that.
Well, as interesting as the lobster in the bathtub conversation was, thinking of changing the subject.
Thank you. Please, Keith, change the subject.
So,
Bring us back to where
I
we
thought
should be.
what Carrie was talking about, she brought up the 1 week class they took called Race is the Basis of Our Worldview. So it seems to me like that class is now like mandatory in government school, right? It's not 1 week, it's 12 years of it.
Yep.
And then the next question is I wrote it down, page 178 of my version. They talk about Walter Gross. He's the head of the party's Office of Racial Politics. So I read that and I thought, how long is it going to be before we have an Office of Racial Politics in DC?
We kind of already do. I just read something. Ibram Kendi, I think he's a scholar. He is now part of an anti-racist unit in DC. I don't know
Oh, wow.
what department it's part of or if it has any actual power or if it's just a think tank, but he had just moved up there and that's his job.
His name, by the way, everyone's going to be hearing. You're going to hear it as much as you hear Robin DiAngelo next. I predict that book of his is the next one that they're going to be pushing out everywhere.
Didn't we just read something by him on Kofefi recently? I feel like we did.
He did a video called "What's the Difference Between Being Non-Racist and Being Anti-Racist?"
Anti-racist is racist. Got it.
That part about it is that it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you treat people that are not racist like they are racist, eventually it leads to everybody becoming racist. That's what's happening. And it's not just in that example, but it's very sad that we're going in that route.
It seems like to be anti-racist is racist, like by definition.
It is.
Yep.
It's exactly what it is. They just call it anti-racist, just like they call Antifa, which they behave like fascists. They call it anti-fascist. I mean, they're great with the names.
I feel like the Nazis would call themselves like the Jewish Salvation Party now. That would be their, if they were branded by today's modern leftists, that would be their name.
Or imagine a place where you can say whatever you want, but they actually call it unsafe when it's really actually safe.
Well, it's unsafe.
Here.
Can you imagine that?
Oh, I get it. I get it.
Hey, I get a couple things I wanted to bring up, just since everybody covered like so much neat stuff along the way. And yes, Carrie, getting hammered, that was one thing I was going to bring up with how they desensitized them to the violence, because I read quite a bit of other stuff about that. But one thing that came up really early was about the record keeping. And I was talking to Thomas about this online, but I never got much into detail on it. Something I suspect about the record keeping that the Japanese also did in this horrific group of theirs, Unit 731, medical experiments, weapons testing, they used prisoners to test horrific stuff. And the record keeping was absolutely meticulous. And one thing with the Nazis keeping records, I think a big chunk of it was they were so convinced that they were going to win and reshape the world, tied into consequences like you all just covered, that they thought there was no consequences to keeping these records because they thought that they were never, even in a bajillion years, were going to lose. So they weren't scared of anyone finding the records. So that's one little thing I wanted to bring up. And then as far as, I think it was Thomas again that brought it up, being away from home, that was something that they used with the police, because you think in their head, they grabbed all these trainees in Hamburg, shipped them off to Poland, 5-7 hours from home. You can refuse, but you only got the other 100 guys in your unit there, and you have these anonymous people. You know, you get away from home for a year doing a horrific exercise every 2 to 5 days. The person that left isn't even there anymore. So that's kind of the two things I wanted to bring up before, because we are going sort of long like usual, but that's fine, like it always is. So that's all I wanted to add to this, because everybody covered so much of the stuff I had written down anyway.
I wanted to touch on the levels of violence that were being described, and it kind of has to do with what Kent was talking about too. That some of them just seem to resign, you know, like what options do they have being away from home, and peer pressure and things like that, and, you know, being or appearing manly in front of, you know, their peers and so on. But the levels of violence were all very different. There were some that were disgusted and kind of remained disgusted throughout. Others did their, you know, followed orders, did the job, and others made a sport of it. And like really disturbing parts where they started doing the hunts in the bunkers and the cellars and, you know, other hiding spots. It was a competition, a thrill, you know, like it really evolved into something else. And how they kept the records, or maybe this was part of the testimony, I can't remember exactly. I listened to the audio, that they basically said that they were shooting strangers and the destitute, as if that was a justification. That was really disturbing to me.
Yeah.
You know, they talked about it as macho, like that it was macho to do the shooting, and the people who wouldn't shoot, they were cowards, they were weak. And it's really the other way around. Like, to me, the brave one is the very few people who used principle to say, this is wrong, I'm not going to do it. But that was rare.
And even those people, when they were testifying or, you know, maybe keeping their records or talking about it, they were not sickened by the inhumanity of mistreating other fellow human beings. They were just disturbed and disgusted by the messiness of it all. And I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts on that really struck me.
One man's testimony was that one person would shoot the mother. I don't know if you remember this part of the book, and that person would shoot the child. And the word that he used for it in German meant savior. He was saving the child from a life without the mother. He was justifying it that way.
Yeah. There was a lot of rationalizations to justify this behavior, and that was one of the ones that stuck out to me as well, Eva. That was pretty bad.
I mean, the scary part, if you think about it, is fortunately we're not in that situation, right? We aren't. But if we were in that situation, how hard would it be to not follow the lead of everybody else? Because I think there was a lot of people that didn't want to follow through, but they just weren't able. I mean, what do? You say, well, I try to hide and go over there and they don't see me, that I'm not shooting anybody. That's the only thing I felt I could do. Some people were doing that, and they're still participating, obviously. But what we have to prevent is getting to the point where we're in that situation, right? Where you have so much power over you that now you're just, I mean, I have to follow the lead because what else can I do? And,
well, I think this circles back to what, go ahead, sorry.
No.
I was just going to say this, what you're saying, Manuel, is this circles back to what Keith was saying earlier about German society generally. And it actually circles back to what I think is probably the most important thing for trying to save our country, which is how we raise our children. So you can raise, and actually Milgram talked about this in his book. When you raise your kids in such a way that they learn that authority is correct by virtue of the fact that it's authority, and I mean, I don't want to go down a parenting rat hole right now, but I totally could, right? Of when you teach your kids that it's right because I said so, and when you employ force to punish and not encourage independent thought and reason, you end up with a child much more likely to obey authority and conform to peer pressure. And the only way to stop this is to have generations of kids who have their own moral compass and are willing to step out and say, I don't care that the authority says this. I don't care about the peer pressure. I won't do it. And if you look at the Milgram experiment, actually some of the groups of people that were more likely to say no were people in the clergy, like people who had a moral, like a sense of moral compass that did not come from society, that was their own moral compass. And they were much more, I'm not shocking that dude. I don't care what you just asked me to do. I don't care that you're the authority. And I think in Germany, you have basically the opposite of independent moral responsibility, just culturally, generally. And so if everyone is that susceptible to authority and peer pressure just as a matter of culture, then when a bad guy gets in charge, really bad things can happen. And I think the only way to really save the society that we love is to have this is again why culture is upstream of politics, it's culture, and to have a philosophy that drove that culture that's based on you are responsible for your moral choices. You need to decide what's right and wrong. We will help you think and give you the tools to do it, but it is your choice. Make right. You don't have to listen to authority. And I don't see that message actually to our kids at all. I see the opposite message being transmitted to our kids, frankly, from both sides of the aisle.
It reminds me, Solzhenitsyn in Gulag Archipelago mentioned that the people that seemed to resist the most were the people who were actually religious. And I think it was a religious person who asked him a question, I can't remember the specific question, that changed him into his new form of thinking, where he started looking at all the things he did on the way that contributed to the complete situation of the Soviet Union, as opposed to just being in a situation he had no control over.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that the government schools in the United States are actually designed from the German school system, right? When they first started public schools, they based it on the late 1800 German school model, which is designed to produce two kinds of people, two kinds of adults, good factory workers and good soldiers. Like, that's the whole purpose of government school.
And by the way, it did produce really good soldiers and really good factory workers.
And it's working today. It still works. It's producing SJWs.
This is depressing now.
What's the positive note we're ending on today, Carter? Who's got the positive note?
Your positivity. You always have a positive note to end on.
You picked the book, Carrie.
I picked the book. If I had a positive note, I don't know. I know I got kind of out there with my thoughts today were kind of jumbled. I have a lot of things in my head at once. I'm trying to pull it apart. My positive note would be that I guess I've fallen into the I guess prior to today's sermon, I think I was thinking about humans as rational thinking beings. As I was taking notes from the sermon, Carter, I was thinking of you. I was like, oh, okay, Carter's in this group, reason, right? But then when he got to the part about humans as being worshipers, I was thinking, I can totally see that too. How do you define man? What separates us from beasts, right? What separates us from animals? Is it because we think? Is it because we worship? Is it because we have emotions? What is it? The idea of thinking about man as worshipful is interesting to me. And I think even if you don't have a belief in a deity or something larger than yourself, you can still find what are those positive things to worship and to take delight in your life, because I think those are very grounding. And then otherwise, if you don't, then I think people will sometimes, you're going to find something to worship. You're going to find something to delight in. And there's a lot of negative, unhealthy things you can focus on worshiping or taking delight in. And I guess my positive note would be, like you were saying, the people who, Thomas, I think, was saying that Solzhenitsyn said the people who managed to resist a bit had some type of maybe a belief in something greater than themselves. I think a belief in something greater than yourself, or even just the things that you worship and that you hold dear and that you take delight in, can be things that ground you and kind of inoculate you from losing a sense of self, from losing your personal belief system when you're in a mob or when you're in an environment that's telling you to do these things that you know to be evil. I don't know if that made sense. I tried to be positive.
Carrie, Beverly C in chat suggests that the positive note we end on is that lobsters are happy sexual creatures.
No. You guys, I was gonna look up this teacher, this professor, or don't, because it's really disturbing.
Let me just atheist.
I wonder what Jordan Peterson would say to you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Jordan Peterson's a different kind of lobster. Yeah. Look, I think pretty clearly the answer. Man as a rational being is the answer. Like, man is the only being that uses his primary means of survival is reason. We don't have claws. We can't run fast. We don't have thick hides. We can't do much. Like, we suck. We die in reality unless we use our functioning reasoning mind to manipulate the environment for us to survive. So to me, that's a pretty closed book question. It's pretty obvious. But I don't think that we need to be, if I'm trying to end on a positive note, my positive note is actually this community, because this community, although it's small, is representative of a much larger silent majority. And this is the last place in the world where you have freedom of movement, the right to bear arms, still have a First Amendment, kind of, in most cases, and we have higher standards of living than most of the world. So if there's going to be a spot that's carved out in the world where the torch of freedom survives and doesn't get extinguished, it will be somewhere in the United States. So maybe it's not all the states, but I think we have, I hope that the people in our community wouldn't pull that trigger. In fact, I had a conversation with someone who's normally in chat, a buddy of mine, the other day. I won't reveal who he was, but he was like, look, here are the trigger points. If it gets this bad, I'm sending my family over here to this plate in the mountains, and I'm going to take a few out with me. I've had a good life. I've got lots of tactical training. I've got lots of weapons. I'm fighting. And I think that the people in this community, and I don't think this community is the only people in the US, this is a very small sampling of people that are like-minded. I think we'll all fight. I know I've already talked to many people in our chat about fighting alongside them. We just need to fight back. And we're armed. Read about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They didn't win, but read about what just a few weapons and the will to fight, how much of an effect that can have, even if it's a small number of people fighting an authoritarian regime. Because I'm telling you what, if that Police Battalion 101 started getting picked off by snipers, they would start having second thoughts about whether or not they want to keep doing what they're doing. And I think this community has the potential to stand up to this.
Well, and stand up with words first.
First words.
First
words. I'm not saying go right to violence, but we've been talking about violence the whole time. So,
It may come to that. And I agree. My positive note is that this community exists and that we can learn from history. There are people that can learn from history. So we're not doomed to repeat it. Like, these people here all understand what happened. And it could come to that. And I was reading an article today, they were comparing different cities. I live in Florida. Like, Florida has over 2 million concealed weapon license holders.
And I used to run.
And the like Orlando and Miami have not had what's happened in Chicago and New York City. And like, it's just not happening. And it's speculation a little bit, but the guy was analyzing different places and he said, it's probably related. They estimate 7 million households in Florida have weapons. It'd be harder to happen here, I think. It's common here. You walk in a bar and somebody will casually mention they have a gun on them. Like, that's normal.
Yeah. I do think it requires us consolidating physically over the next few decades. I don't know when, but like, I do think being spread out, they can pick us off more easily with their laws. But
Twee Girl in the chat says that it started for her with saying no. And that's why I keep this cross stitch here. I don't know if you could see this. My no cross stitch, which is. Are you laughing at that?
I don't know why it's awesome, but I love that.
Because for some people, saying no is hard, and you have to learn how to say no. And saying no to my old belief system and refusing to go along with it was huge for me. It took me a long time to be able to do that. But Solzhenitsyn, who Thomas mentioned earlier, I believe it's him. He has a quote about it's like let the lie come into the world. And there's some other part there I'm forgetting. He says, but not through me. Like, I will not speak it. And that's a huge, huge first step for people.
Yep. All right, we should wrap it up. We should thank Julianne. She just sent us another super chat. She says, I'm learning from you. Love Unsafe Space. Welcome, Julianne. Carrie, do we want to reveal what the next book is?
I think we already did. Why don't you go ahead, since it's your pick?
It's a real positive.
So what, Keith?
I said the next book is a real positive note.
The next book is a positive note. Yeah. It is my pick. I apologize in advance that it is long. Don't skip over the long speech in the middle that you're going to want to skip over, because it's very important. But we're going to read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And I challenge you. I know there's going to be people that are going to push back and they're going to say, I've heard all these negative things about Ayn Rand, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to say two things at the outset. I'm not a Randroid. I like a lot of what she said. I'm not telling you guys, this isn't the Bible. This is just a book. It's a good book with a lot of good ideas that should be thought-provoking. And the other thing I'm going to say is, everyone who's told you how horrible Rand is hasn't read her, probably. Almost everyone that has a problem with her, they haven't read her. In fact, I've told this story before. I'm going to tell it again because I love this story. One of my friends 20 years ago was doing this commute thing where it's called rideshare in the Bay Area. You just wait on one side of a bridge at a little stop, and anyone can come along and pick you up as they're going into the city during rush hour. And then you get, they get to be in the high occupancy vehicle lane and go faster, and then they drop you off downtown. So you get rides with random people all the time. And she was reading Atlas Shrugged, and she got into the car and she sat there reading. She's very quiet. She wasn't like an interacting kind of person. So she sat there reading, and the driver looked at her. This person, by the way, the person reading it was what they would now call a person of color. He's reading the book, and the driver said, "How can you read that filth? She's racist, blah, 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 blah." Started spouting. And my friend said, "Oh, I haven't gotten to that part yet. I don't see the racism yet. Where is that? Show me." And my friend just recommended me. I don't want to read a racist book. And the person's response was, "Well, I don't know. I've never read it, but I heard it." Oh, okay, sure. So Ayn Rand is the antidote to racism. So anyway, we're going to read Atlas Shrugged. I don't know when we're going to set the date. We'll probably give you a little extra time because it's a lot to get done in a month, unless you're Keith, who read it straight without sleeping. In like a day.
The last time I read it.
Yeah.
And it's a good book. And it's on deck. I have it right here. And as you can see, this copy has been read before.
Yeah.
I'll just tell people, I still remember the day Carter came into work and said, "Have you ever read this book by Ayn Rand called Atlas Shrugged?" Yeah, that's a great book.
Yep. All right. So on that note, are we good, Carrie?
I want to know what Jeanette's dog's name is, and then we can go.
Okay.
It's Axel.
Hi, Axel.
All right, there's your positive note to the show.
Yeah.
Axel's the positive note.
Always, a dog's always a positive note.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching and listening. And
boy.
we will return tomorrow for coffee break at the regular time, 11 a.m. Pacific. So we'll see you then.
Thanks, everybody. It was fun.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Please avoid any contact with these individuals. I have calculated a 97.8% chance that these are all Russian bots. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Please connect to CNN to receive the latest version of your belief system software. All hail Chris Cuomo. That last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.